I am live. I'm reading one of Joan Grant's far memory books. This one is entitled Return to Elysium, and it plays in ancient Greece, 2 centuries BC. She is Lucina, and she has been brought to the island of Elysium with 13 years old, and we are still in the beginning here. It is chapter 3. And it's entitled, oh, is it 4? No, it's in chapter 4. It's entitled Merchants' Scales. Even at mealtimes, when the conversation was never profound, for Asclepius said that mental effort interfered with digestion, Epicurus seldom laughed unless someone made a deliberate joke. Then he would pause to make quite sure that humor was intended, threw back his head and made a honking noise which reminded me of wild geese flying overhead in winter. His eyes were grey with short, thick lashes, and his body and a solidity which made him a little clumsy with the discus, though he would wrestle better than any other, except Praxiteles. I had never liked him particularly until the day he took me to the storeroom, which was not until I had been in Elysium about 6 months. Here, in his private world, he seemed a different person, interested, alert, eager to share his enthusiasm. He opened jars of honey for me from Mount Hynetus, from Delos, from Rhodes, honey dark as beer or pale in sunlight. He told me to use a different finger for each kind so that I could compare the flavor and listen to my opinion as though I were Asclepius, deciding the merits of wines. Then he loosed the cords that bound the bales of stuffs from which our clothes were made. The wool for winter clothes came from the fleece of wild sheep, and there were more ordinary kinds which the servants wore. The thinnest wool came from Kos, which also sent us cotton for summer tunics. While he showed me linen, some so fine that it was transparent, he told me how he had been to Alexandria and travelled by barge up the Nile to Heliopolis. He let me rub ointment on my hands so that the warmth of my skin brought out the sweet and crumbled dry herb smell until they sifted between my fingers in odorous powders. How could I have thought Epicurus dull, when everything he showed me was the clue to an exciting story? Why had I been so slow in discovering that tallies should be more interesting than books? So you share my love of things, Lucina, he said. You're not bored with a steward? Please, can I come here often? I will even learn to add properly if you let me help with the tallies, and try to remember the different ways in which things are measured and weighed and sold. For one so resistant to lessons in the art of numbers, that is a great concession and I'm deeply honored. I'm not really stupid when I want to learn, I said frankly, but numbers, which don't belong to anything real, are such a waste of memory. We are all supposed to be seeking reality in Elysium, but I seem to be the only one who realizes that things are real. The others pretend to despise what I value, but don't let yourself be decoyed into following them. People are too unreliable as objects of devotion, being subjects to constant change which cannot be accurately predicted, even by Asclepius. Wouldn't people be very dull if they didn't change? He looked surprised. Does an ingot of silver lose its quality because it cannot turn into a lump of cheese or find itself transmuted into gold? But you're a man, not a metal. You can't help thinking, so you have to grow, and growth must mean change. Don't you want to grow, Epicurus? I want to know about real tangible things. I want to know why figs from Africa are better than any others, and why Attica also produces the finest olive oil. It is nonsense, of course, that this is due to the groves being under the special protection of Athene. I want to discover the precise value of each commodity in relation to all other commodities. The real value, not the false, which is made by men who cannot decide what they want or why they want it. Within every lifetime there is war and famine. Men die in thousands because merchants cannot agree. And why can't they agree? Why do they lie and haggle and cheat? Because they try to falsify the basic value to enrich themselves. Or is it because people find it too difficult to be honest? People. His voice was near to tears. People spoil everything. Silly, cruel, squalid little people. Their horrid tastes which have to be satisfied on other men's blood. They are idiot children to be pacified into temporary good humor, and they call this freedom. They go to war because it makes them feel important, and die for futility, which they have not the courage to recognize. They are born because their parents lack discrimination. Why should children be born unless a surplus of goods justifies an increase in population? Why? Because people are too lazy and cruel to realize it is wicked to invite more people than the house can feed. Don't women sometimes have babies because they want them to love? I mean, not because they might be useful. Of course they do. I said the world was full of irresponsible adolescents who refuse to grow up even when they are senile. I don't know about the world. I have only lived in the island, and here. Well, stay here if you wish to go on believing that it is safe to love people. If you intend to leave Elysium, learn to love things, old, beautiful, solid things, which days and months and centuries cannot spoil. You had better hear what happens in the world, and then you won't let it break you if Asclepius dies and we have to leave here. It's not a pretty story. Do you want to listen? I nodded, and he began. My father collected imperishable beauty, vases from Attica and Rhodes, figurines from Crete, bronzes from Andros and Sparta. He was happy until he tried to collect the living beauty of a woman. He built a house for her near Athens, which was considered one of the jewels of the city. The marble alone cost him 10,000 staters. In the gardens were statues by Phidias and the real Praxiteles. She wanted fountains and ornamental pools, so he built an aqueduct which could have supplied a town. He wanted a large family, but I was their only child, the limit of her generosity. He gave me everything. She could not be bothered even to choose my clothes, saying that she had nothing to contribute to a son already so lavishly endowed. Her lack of appreciation was incredible. I remember him giving her a vase from Mycena, over 1,000 years old, and she complained that it was very cracked. It was useless for flowers. She kept embroidery threads in a casket which had come from a royal tomb of Egypt, and wore a pectoral that had belonged to some queen as though it were a string of coral beads. Instead of realizing that she was too stupid to value his gifts, he thought her taste so fastidious that he must find still more beautiful things to satisfy her. She must have known he was ruining himself, but she made no attempt to stop him. I overheard their final quarrel. He confessed in abject abasement that he had spent his last sack of coins and owed vast amounts to merchants. She laughed at him and said he deserved poverty for having tried to buy her clemency because he was too cowardly to entrust her with his heart. That night she poisoned herself. I found her body. She was lying on a gold and ivory couch that had belonged to a Ptolemaic princess. Beside it were coffers, their lids open to display the treasures he had given her. She had even made her own funeral wreaths and set lamps at her head and feet. There was a scroll beside her, and on it was written in her fine, delicate hand, I cannot wait any longer to use your only gift, which has not disappointed me, the memorable sarcophagus made for the woman you forgot to love. I fled from the house to a wine shop and woke 2 days later to find it was not a hideous dream. I went back to the house. It was empty save for beauty, destroyed by a man, driven insane. The floors were covered with shards of pottery, splinters of ivory, jewels wrenched from their settings, precious ointments trampled into charred carpets which had taken 5 years to grow on the loom. The curtains had been slashed, the furniture hacked to pieces. Fire had blackened the walls and cracked the frescoes. I found my father in the treasure room, the empty treasure room. He was sitting on the floor playing with a gold statue of Ptah, an Egyptian god, as though he were a child with a toy. He looked up at me and said in a small, pitiful voice, "He is too strong, too beautiful to destroy. Do you think she will let me keep him?" I gave her everything, but it was not enough. I was only 16, ignorant except in learning, for I had always been indulged and protected. At least I had the decency to hide my father from other men's pity. I took him to a small farm which belonged to a freed slave, who had reason to wish to repay my family's generosity. Even from the ruined house I saved a few things which had escaped destruction. Gold is still gold, even when only its value as metal remains. When I no longer had these fragments to sell, I worked for a foreign merchant who found useful my knowledge of where he might find buyers. I, who had often been a guest in those houses, was not recognized when I went to the servants' courts to beg for my wares to be considered by the master. My father lived another 3 years. He thought that he was a child, and I the slave who had looked after him. He could not wash himself and had to be fed with a spoon. His only pleasure were toys, small, brightly colored toys, which the slaves buy for their children. He had a doll and a wooden horse with a red saddle. He never played with a gold statue but kept it hidden under his pillow. He said it was a present he was going to give to a beautiful woman when he grew up. He buried it. I buried it with him. Suddenly he began to cry. I put my arms around him too. He knelt beside me, his body shaking convulsively, his tears dripping on my bare knee. "I loved him, Lucina," he said desperately. "I loved him, and that is why I am never going to love any person again. Please help me find things to love. Don't let me believe in people again." "Your father loved things and they didn't make him happy." He raised his head and looked at me. "But I don't want rare, irreplaceable things. I only want to know about figs and wine and spices, things which belong to everyone, things of which there will always be enough for everyone who isn't greedy." "Aren't there enough people for everybody?" "No, there is too little love in the world, only enough to make you hungry for more. And there's never love without fear. People die, Lucina. They take your heart into the ground with them, or you take theirs. You cannot dare to love unless you're very brave, and if you're brave, you don't need anyone to help you. Asclepius is strong. If we all died, he would still be the same person. He believes in himself, but I don't. I don't believe in anything. Dictys and Elissa are very ordinary people and not very brave, but I think they love each other, even if not very much. They know that it will be lonely for the one who is the last to die, but they will have memories to help them, like a lamp in a dark room. Can you forget the hurt of your father's sorrow and remember the strength your loving gave you?" It did bring you strength, dear Epicurus. It made you able to look after him and give him the things he wanted when he really needed them. A toy from the market, a wooden horse given to me out of charity by a peddler. But they were the things he wanted. He felt like a child because life had been too difficult in the way he lived it. Perhaps your mother felt like an ordinary woman who wanted to work for her husband to be loved in a small, commonplace way. She may have been a real person and neither of them knew it. So real that she killed herself to enjoy the full taste of hatred? Or because they were both so very lonely. Lonely? He stood up and rubbed the back of his hand across his eyes. Lonely? What do you know about loneliness? Spend 10 years cringing to foreigners, 10 years cut off by poverty from your own kind of people, and spend another 3 years living in Elysium, among people who think you're cold and remote, content to live by tallies, to weigh your heart in a merchant's scale. Do that at your peril. Then talk to me of loneliness, and I will weep for pity. I don't need to wait so long. Thank you for not seeing that I have been crying too. I'm young and very unimportant, but I can understand much better than a statue, even a very beautiful statue. We can help each other, if you don't mind my being so young. Both of us need to learn how to be brave enough to love. Love, he said slowly, is love not the enemy? Is love perhaps the only freedom? I think so, I said, but I'm not very clever. He smiled, and the first time I had ever seen him smile like that. Aren't you, Lucina? He kissed me on the forehead. You have seen me cry, and I'm not ashamed. Isn't that very clever? Yes, that is very clever. The next chapter is chapter 5, and it's entitled Lamplight. It's Monday.